Hey guys, it's Miss Stewart. Make sure you have your notebook out and get ready to write some notes because here is another lesson for you. This week, we're continuing on to learn about World War II. Last week, we talked about mostly the war or the beginning of the war in Europe. This week, we're going to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean and talk about how the U.S. got involved with Japan. So we're going to be on the other side of the world. So if you can see this map that I pulled up, you can notice that United States is smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and Japan and the Atlantic Ocean and Europe. So they're going to end up being smack dab in the middle of this war. Anyways, so I'm going to play for you the video recording of my lecture. For this PowerPoint, you want to write down everything that's in blue. All right, so like I said earlier, please make sure you record everything in blue. So this starts off with Pearl Harbor because the U.S. isn't really officially a part of the war. They're still doing their cash and carry neutrality stance. But after December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Like you have this on your timeline already. That's an important date you want to remember. And until 1942, the Japanese were gaining land all over the Pacific Ocean. They were taking all of the European countries' territories or colonies, and the U.S. was not winning the war in the Pacific. They were losing pretty bad. And this question here is, why do you think the U.S. was not winning the war right away? Because when they entered, if you looked at that map that I brought up earlier, the U.S. is in the middle of the Europe and the Pacific and Japan. So they're kind of having to split themselves between sending help to the Allies in Europe and fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese. All right, so here's a little up closer look at our Pacific theater. So the theater is just kind of like where the war is fought. You can see Japan is right here, and this is all the territory they've gained. They gained Manchuria. They went down to Nanking, China's capital. They got Thailand, all of the Indies right here, the East Indies. The Philippines are going to be fighting a lot on the Philippines. And here's Hawaii right here with Pearl Harbor. That's where they attacked in December 7th, 1941. All right, so like I said, we're going to go fight over in the Philippines. So December 7th, important date, Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Hours later, they flew planes over to the Philippines and started attacking the airfields in the Philippines. And then 2 days later, they're going to land troops in the Philippines and fight against the Americans that are and the Filipinos that are already there. All right, the Philippines are going to fall to the Japanese April 9th, 1942. Americans are going to surrender the peninsula that is in the Philippines. And then the Japanese are going to start the Bataan Death March, where 78,000 prisoners of war, including Americans, walk 65 miles. And in this 65 miles, about 10,000 of them are going to die. May of 1942, the rest of the Philippines fell to the Japanese. So the Japanese now have control over the Philippine Islands. All right, you have the Doolittle raid. So back in the United States, President Roosevelt begins to plan how to attack Tokyo. Like, how do we get back at the Japanese? How do we start winning this war? They've already bombed Pearl Harbor. They've taken over the Philippines. They beat us in the Philippines. It's getting a little embarrassing. And then by March, 16 B-25 bombers were loaded onto the aircraft called the Hornet. That's that picture there. And headed across the Pacific. And then by April, America started bombing the actual islands of Japan. So starting to make progress. One of the first battles is the Battle of the Coral Sea. March 1942. The U.S. decoded messages that they were going to attack New Guinea, and then in May of the same year, the U.S. and Japan launched airstrikes against each other. So they're just going to keep like bombing each other using their planes. One U.S. aircraft carrier sank, another damaged, but Japan was prevented from landing on New Guinea. So it's going to be kind of a win for the U.S. Yes, we lost an aircraft carrier, but we prevented them from gaining more territory. All right, Battle of Midway. The U.S. is going to use aircraft carriers. They're going to be really important in their fighting in the Pacific Ocean, right? Because a lot of these jet planes and fighter planes cannot fly the whole length of the Pacific Ocean. So they're going to load the aircraft carriers, kind of use the boat. We're going to go out to sea, and they're going to launch them from a distance that they can fly. So from the aircraft carriers, the U.S. could fly jets that would help out with the different battles in the Pacific, in the islands of Japan, Philippines. So they are going to be very important in all of these battles and in fighting in the Pacific Ocean. Battle of Midway. So June 4th, we're still in 1942. The U.S. is going to plan an ambush. So an ambush is when it's kind of like a surprise sneak attack. And 38 Japanese planes are going to end up being shot down. So, and then the Japanese are going to try to prepare for like a second wave of planes shooting them down. But the U.S., they're going to launch a counterattack, and 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were then sunk. So after a 4th aircraft carrier was sunk, they retreated. So they didn't surrender. They just kind of turned around and went back to where they came from. This was a major turning point in the war in the Pacific. This is going to stop a Japanese advance. So it's considered a U.S. victory. So here's some pictures of some bombers and an aircraft carrier. The USS exits. So it is going to be part of the Okinawa campaign. So they're going to bring a lot of the fighters and the bomber planes with it during World War II. All right, Battle of Midway. So we talked about it. Here's kind of a map on how the Japanese forces are kind of turning around. They went all the way up kind of by Alaska, turned around, so on and so forth. Here's some more pictures of them fighting in the Pacific. These are actually, this one on the right here, that is an attack on a U.S. aircraft carrier by a kamikaze pilot. So we have an island hopping campaign. So starting in September 1943, so we're now in 1943, the U.S. began their island hopping campaign, which consisted of a strategy of jumping from island to island to get closer to Japan. So take over one island, move to the next island, take over another island, keep on moving. All right, I mentioned kamikazes in that picture before. So the Japanese are going to be really ruthless fighters. So kamikazes basically are suicide pilots. They're fighter pilots, and they would literally dive bomb into the Allied powers' aircraft carriers. And if you're in a plane and you're dive bombing and you crash into an aircraft carrier, it's a suicide mission. So these pilots, they knew what they were doing. They were sacrificing their lives and basically committing suicide trying to attack the United States aircraft carriers. See, there's that picture again. All right, here is another Battle of the Guadalcanal. This is going to be August 1942, so it's a U.S. win, land victory, using Navajo code talkers. So they're using people who speak the Navajo language. The U.S. had intel that they, meaning the Japanese, were building a secret air base on the island. So like I said, the Navajo code talkers. This is not 2020 it's people are easily tapping into other people's frequencies and picking up on their messages. Even if they're coded, they can uncode the messages pretty easily. So the Allied powers, meaning the US, they use Navajo Native American code talkers. So they spoke in this Navajo language and would communicate important messages from island to island and boat to boat. This worked because the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, they could not understand the Navajo language. Like they just didn't understand it. So they were not able to kind of crack this code, and it allowed the Allied powers to communicate more effectively. All right, so there's a picture of them using the radio to code to talk back and forth to each other. All right, so these are going to be two really important battles coming up. You have the Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. These are battles where the Allies started to bomb Japan and weaken their defenses. So they have to establish bases on the islands near Japan. And these islands, the Japanese defended them pretty fiercely, didn't give up, didn't surrender. So the first one, Iwo Jima. This is where we get that famous flag picture that you've probably seen before. This is from February to March 26, 1945. So 23,000 U.S. troops were killed or wounded in order to take this island. But it was a victory for the U.S. And like I said, someone snapped a photo of them raising the U.S. flag upon their victory. Okinawa, same year, April to June 1945. Japanese defended the island, still didn't surrender. And then basically this was the last island that the Japanese needed to get to before being able to get close enough to invade Japan. But instead of surrendering, instead of taking over, it was a mass suicide by the Japanese soldiers. So all the Japanese soldiers end up killing themselves before they would surrender. So it's kind of making the U.S. question, like, are they even going to surrender? Is it even going to be worth it fighting the Japanese? So because the Japanese are so ruthless, we're starting to come up with the Manhattan Project back home. It is a completely secret plan to develop the atomic bomb with the help of Albert Einstein. All right, so the two atomic bombs that they create are the little boy and the fat man. And this is going to basically end the war in the Pacific, is the dropping of these bombs. President Truman takes over as president after FDR died. Truman then decides to drop the first atomic bomb on Japan, knowing that the Japanese are refusing to surrender. So this atomic bomb will save American soldiers' lives because we're not really going to be fighting on the ground anymore, but it will cost many Japanese women and children and civilians their lives. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So August 6th, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 80,000 people died and 1,000 more injured. Japan still did not surrender after this first bomb was dropped. So after the Hiroshima bombing, President Truman announced, if they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which has never been seen on this earth. Like, we are the first country that are using this atomic bomb. We have this power, and it's kind of going to lead up to the Cold War, which we'll talk about next chapter. August 9th, 3 days later, we bombed Nagasaki. And then after this bombing with the atomic bomb, the emperor finally surrenders and the U.S. wins. So these are some of the effects of the atomic bomb, and there's actually going to be a lot of long-term effects, long-term radiation. So while it killed, in Hiroshima, 80,000 initially, many more are going to die from the long-term effects. That's what the city looks like after the bomb was dropped. VJ Day. So this is when the emperor is going to surrender on August 10th. and they officially assign the surrender documents on September 2nd, 1945. So Japan officially surrenders, U.S. wins the war in the Pacific.